The blood in the bathroom sink was darker than the winter sky outside. Robert Bob Mitchell, 68 and tougher than Cleveland steel, stopped mid-cough, his weathered marine hands gripping the porcelain edge as crimson droplets mixed with melting snow from the window ledge. This wasn't the usual morning hack that came with December's bite. Sarah's coffee mug shattered against the kitchen floor when she heard the retching echo through their suburban home. David bolted upright in bed 3 houses down, that cop instinct screaming danger even before his phone buzzed with the emergency ringtone. Emma's Christmas stocking hung cheerfully by the fireplace, a stark contrast to the terror creeping through the house like winter fog. Bob touched the lump on his neck, bigger now, angry and demanding attention he'd refused to give for months. "Sarah!" The word tore from his throat like shrapnel. Who was calling at 3:47 a.m. on December 23rd? What had been growing inside him all this time, and why did every instinct tell him Christmas might be his last? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, when summer still painted Cleveland in shades of hope, the Mitchell family had gathered around their backyard grill like they had every 4th of July since David was Emma's age. Bob Mitchell stood at his post, spatula in hand, regaling his 8-year-old granddaughter with stories that made her giggle, and her parents exchanged knowing glances. At 68, he remained the anchor of their small world. A man whose Purple Heart and Bronze Star medals lay quietly in a bedroom drawer while his real treasures ran around the yard in pigtails and grass-stained sneakers. "Tell me about the helicopters again, Grandpa," Emma had begged, her eyes wide with the wonder that only children possess. Bob's weathered face softened as he knelt to her level, his voice dropping to that conspiratorial whisper reserved for bedtime stories and shared secrets. "Well, sweetheart, sometimes when you're scared and far from home, you learn that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when your hands are shaking." Sarah Mitchell watched this exchange from the kitchen window, her trained nurse's eye catching the subtle tremor in her father-in-law's hands that had nothing to do with age. At 38, she'd spent 10 years in the ICU before Emma arrived, and some instincts never fade. The persistent cough that had started in spring, the way Bob touched his neck when he thought no one was looking, these details filed themselves away in the corner of her mind marked concern. David emerged from the house carrying a tray of his famous corn on the cob, his police detective badge catching the afternoon sun. 15 years on, Cleveland's force had taught him to read people, but with his father he saw only what he wanted to see. The Marine who'd taught him to throw a curveball, the man who'd held him when his mother Martha passed 3 years ago, the grandfather who made Emma laugh until her sides hurt. The idea that this pillar of strength might be vulnerable seemed as impossible as snow in July. "Dad, you're burning the burgers," David called out, and Bob straightened with a grunt that he quickly disguised as a laugh. These moments, ordinary, precious, unrepeatable, would later feel like photographs taken moments before an earthquake. The laughter, the smell of charcoal in summer, Emma's delighted squeals as the sprinkler soaked her sundress, all of it capturing a family still whole, still believing that love and stubbornness could conquer anything. But even then, in that golden afternoon light, Sarah noticed how Bob's cough lingered a beat too long after each laugh. She noticed how he absently rubbed his neck, the same gesture her patients made when something deep inside whispered that not everything was as it should be. She almost mentioned it to David that night as they cleaned dishes and Emma chased fireflies in the yard. Almost. Instead, she filed it away with all the other small worries that accumulate in a mother's heart. The endless inventory of love wrapped in vigilance that would soon prove more prophetic than she could have imagined. The morning after the 4th of July barbecue, Bob Mitchell woke to find blood on his pillowcase. Not much, just a few dark spots that could have been dismissed as a nosebleed or bitten tongue, but enough to make his hand instinctively move to the tender spot on his neck that had been bothering him for weeks. Standing before the bathroom mirror in the pale dawn light, he pressed his fingers against what felt like a marble buried beneath his skin. "Probably just a swollen gland," he muttered to his reflection, the same words he'd been repeating like a mantra since Memorial Day. But mantras don't make lumps disappear, and by the time Sarah arrived for Sunday dinner 2 weeks later, even Bob's masterful deflection couldn't hide the worsening cough that punctuated every conversation. Sarah watched him across the kitchen table, noting how he touched his neck between bites of her pot roast, how he cleared his throat with increasing frequency, how the laugh lines around his eyes seemed deeper, carved by something other than joy. "Bob, that cough's gotten worse," she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd spent a decade coaxing reluctant patients toward necessary truths. "When's the last time you saw Dr. Williams?" "Don't need a doctor to tell me I'm getting old," Bob replied, but his deflection lacked its usual conviction. Emma looked up from her mashed potatoes with the radar children possess for adult tensions, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. "Grandpa coughs a lot now," she observed with 8-year-old directness. "Like Mrs. Henderson's cat before it went to heaven." The silence that followed Emma's innocent observation stretched until David cleared his throat, a sound eerily similar to his father's persistent hack. "Maybe she's right, Dad. Maybe you should get it checked out, just to be safe." Bob's jaw set in that familiar line that had weathered 3 tours in Vietnam and 30 years on the factory floor. "I've survived worse than a summer cold, son. This old body's just reminding me it's been around the block a few times." But even as he spoke, his fingers found that spot on his neck again, pressing against the lump that seemed to pulse with its own stubborn life. It was Emma who finally broke through his resistance, climbing onto his lap after dinner and placing her small hand on his chest. "Grandpa, you sound like you have rocks in your throat. Does it hurt?" Her brown eyes, Martha's eyes, looked up at him with such genuine concern that Bob felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. "A little, sweetheart," he admitted, wrapping his arms around her slight frame. "But you know what? I think maybe I should have someone take a look just to make sure I can keep up with you on the playground." The appointment with Dr. Richard Williams was scheduled for the following Monday. Bob had been seeing Williams for nearly a decade. Routine physicals, the occasional bout of bronchitis, nothing that couldn't be solved with a prescription and a pat on the shoulder. The doctor's office occupied the ground floor of a converted Victorian house, its waiting room filled with the kind of worn furniture and outdated magazines that suggested competence over comfort. "So, Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Williams said after a perfunctory examination that lasted all of 8 minutes, "sounds like you've got a bit of inflammation. Probably picked up something at that barbecue. You know how it is when families get together. Lots of germs passing around." He scribbled something on his prescription pad without looking up. "This antibiotic should clear it right up. 2 weeks and you'll be good as new." Bob shifted on the examination table, the paper crinkling beneath him. "What about this lump on my neck, Doc? It's been there for a while now." Williams glanced up briefly, his fingers probing Bob's neck with the distracted efficiency of someone running behind schedule. "Lymph node. Perfectly normal when you're fighting an infection. The antibiotics will take care of that too." He tore the prescription from his pad and handed it over. "Come back in 2 weeks if you're not feeling better." As Bob left the office, prescription in hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been missed. Williams hadn't asked about his military service, hadn't inquired about his exposure to chemicals overseas, hadn't even seemed particularly concerned about the size or location of the lump. But doctors knew what they were doing, didn't they? And Bob Mitchell had spent his entire life following orders from people who presumably knew better than he did. The antibiotic sat on his kitchen counter for 14 days. dutifully consumed with breakfast and dinner, while the cough grew worse and the lump seemed to pulse with increasing insistence. When Bob returned for his follow-up appointment, Dr. Williams barely looked up from his chart. "Still bothering you? Let's try a stronger antibiotic. Sometimes these things are stubborn." Another prescription, another dismissive pat on the shoulder, another 2 weeks of waiting for relief that never came. October 15th arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that should have filled Bob Mitchell with the satisfaction of another season weathered, another year survived. Instead, he found himself gasping for breath on the sidelines of Emma's soccer game, his hand pressed against his throat as if he could somehow force the air past whatever was blocking his windpipe. The lump on his neck had grown to the size of a golf ball, visible now even when he wasn't touching it, a grotesque monument to months of medical dismissal. "Grandpa!" Emma's voice cut through his struggle as she noticed him doubled over on the bleachers. Her teammates continued their pursuit of the ball across the field, but Emma's attention had shifted entirely to the man who'd never missed one of her games, who always cheered the loudest, who now looked smaller somehow, diminished by an enemy he couldn't see or fight. Sarah reached him first, her nursing instincts taking over as she guided him down from the bleachers. "We're going to the emergency room," she said, her voice brooking no argument. "Right now." Bob tried to protest, but the words came out as a wheeze that sent ice through David's veins. This wasn't the invincible Marine who'd taught him to face down bullies and stand up for what was right. This was an old man struggling to breathe, and the sight of it terrified them all. The emergency room at Cleveland General buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Saturday afternoon, minor injuries from weekend warriors, children with fevers, elderly patients whose bodies had chosen inconvenient moments to remind them of their mortality. Bob sat in the wheelchair that Sarah had insisted upon, his breathing labored but stable, while they waited for a doctor who might actually listen. Dr. Rebecca Torres emerged from behind a curtain with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd seen everything trauma could dish out. She took one look at Bob's neck and frowned. "How long has that mass been there?" she asked, her hands already moving to examine the growth that had been dismissed as a swollen lymph node for months. "Since at least July," Sarah answered when Bob seemed too focused on breathing to respond. "His family doctor has been treating it as an infection, but it's only gotten worse." Dr. Torres's frown deepened as she palpated the area around Bob's neck, her fingers mapping the contours of something that clearly didn't belong. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to order a CT scan. This needs to be imaged immediately." She turned to the nurse. "Get him scheduled for the next available slot." But even as relief began to flood through the family, the hospital's administrative machinery ground into motion with its own inexorable logic. Bob's insurance required pre-authorization for imaging studies. Dr. Williams would need to approve the scan, and Dr. Williams, when contacted, expressed skepticism about the rushed recommendation. "I've been treating Mr. Mitchell for months." His voice crackled through the phone speaker in the emergency department. "This is simply an enlarged lymph node responding slowly to treatment. A CT scan is unnecessary and expensive. I recommend discharge with a stronger course of antibiotics." Sarah felt something snap inside her chest, not audibly, but with the finality of a bridge cable giving way under too much stress. "That's not an enlarged lymph node," she said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "That's a mass that's been growing for months while you've been throwing antibiotics at it and hoping it would disappear." Dr. Torres looked between the phone and Sarah's flushed face, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama playing out in her emergency department. "Mr. Mitchell, I strongly recommend follow-up with an oncologist," she said finally. "But without your primary physician's approval, insurance won't cover the imaging today." The ride home passed in silence, broken only by Bob's labored breathing and Emma's quiet sniffles from the back seat. Sarah stared out the passenger window, watching Cleveland's working-class neighborhoods roll past in a blur of autumn colors that seemed to mock their situation. How could leaves change from green to gold while Bob's doctors remained blind to what was happening right in front of them? That night, after Emma was finally asleep and David had returned to his patrol shift, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and a cup of cold coffee growing a skin beside the mouse pad. The nursing textbooks she'd boxed away when Emma was born emerged from the basement, their pages yellowed but their knowledge still sharp. She typed search terms with the systematic precision of someone who'd once charted symptoms for 12-hour shifts. Neck mass, elderly male, Vietnam veteran, Agent Orange exposure. The results painted a picture that made her stomach clench with a mixture of rage and vindication. Page after page described cases identical to Bob's, veterans presenting with neck masses, respiratory symptoms, and a history of chemical exposure during their service in Southeast Asia. The medical literature was clear. Any physician treating a Vietnam veteran with these symptoms should immediately suspect Agent Orange-related cancers and order appropriate imaging. Dr. Williams should have known. Any competent physician should have known. The moment Bob mentioned his military service, alarm bells should have been ringing in any doctor's office worth the diplomas hanging on its walls. But somehow, inexplicably, those connections had never been made. Months of precious time had been lost to medical arrogance disguised as prudent care. Sarah printed everything: research papers, case studies, treatment protocols, creating a folder thick enough to serve as evidence in what felt increasingly like a case of criminal negligence. Tomorrow she would march into Dr. Williams's office armed with documentation and demand the care Bob should have received months ago. She would not leave without a referral for imaging. And if Williams refused, she would find someone who understood that behind every set of symptoms was a human being whose life hung in the balance. Sarah Mitchell walked into Dr. Williams' office the next morning carrying a manila folder thick with research and a determination forged by sleepless hours of medical detective work. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman whose smile seemed perpetually strained by the demands of managing a busy practice, looked up with the weary expression of someone accustomed to dealing with anxious family members. "I need to speak with Dr. Williams about my father-in-law's case," Sarah said, placing the folder on the reception desk with enough force to make the woman's coffee cup rattle against its saucer. "Robert Mitchell. It's urgent." "The doctor doesn't typically take walk-in consultations," the receptionist replied, her tone suggesting this conversation had been rehearsed countless times. "I can schedule you an appointment for next week if—" "This can't wait until next week." Sarah opened the folder and spread several research papers across the desk, their highlighted passages catching the fluorescent light like evidence at a crime scene. "Your doctor has been misdiagnosing a Vietnam veteran for months while a potentially fatal condition has been progressing unchecked." The receptionist's eyes widened as she scanned the medical literature, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to genuine concern. After a whispered phone conversation, she gestured toward the hallway. "Dr. Williams can see you now." Dr. Richard Williams sat behind his desk like a man accustomed to authority, his white coat pristine, his manner suggesting that whatever complaint Sarah might voice could be easily dismissed with the right combination of medical jargon and paternal condescension. But as Sarah methodically laid out her research, case study after case study of veterans with identical presentations, treatment protocols that should have been followed, diagnostic criteria that had been ignored, his expression began to shift. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said when she finished her presentation, "I appreciate your concern, but I've been practicing medicine for over 20 years. Mr. Mitchell's presentation is consistent with a chronic lymphatic response to infection. Not every veteran with a cough has Agent Orange-related cancer." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the final paper in her folder, a treatment guideline from the Department of Veterans Affairs that explicitly recommended immediate imaging for any Vietnam veteran presenting with unexplained neck masses. "This says otherwise," she replied, her voice steady despite the fury building behind her ribs. According to the VA's own protocols, Bob should have had a CT scan 3 months ago. For a moment, something flickered across Dr. Williams' face, not quite recognition, but something deeper and more troubling. His hands, Sarah noticed, had developed a slight tremor as he shuffled through her documentation. I'll consider ordering the imaging," he said finally. "But I want you to understand that unnecessary scans expose patients to radiation and create anxiety over findings that are likely benign." "And I want you to understand," Sarah replied, standing and gathering her papers with deliberate precision, "that if my father-in-law dies because you were too proud or too careless to consider his military history, I will make sure every medical board in Ohio knows exactly how you practiced medicine when it mattered most." The CT scan, when it finally came 2 weeks later, revealed what Sarah's nursing instincts had suspected for months. The mass on Bob's neck was not a swollen lymph node, but a complex growth with tentacles extending toward his airway and major blood vessels. The radiologist's report used words like concerning and recommend immediate oncology consultation and cannot rule out malignancy. But by then, Bob's condition had deteriorated to the point where climbing stairs left him gasping for breath. Halloween came and went without his usual enthusiasm for Emma's costume. A brave night that year, chosen specifically to make her grandfather smile. Instead, Bob sat in his recliner, oxygen concentrator humming beside him like a mechanical reminder of his mortality, while Emma showed off her armor and plastic sword with forced cheerfulness. "Grandpa, are you going to get better?" she asked one evening in November, climbing onto his lap with the careful movements of a child who'd been warned about being gentle. Bob's arms, once strong enough to lift her above his head, now trembled with the effort of holding her slight frame. "I'm fighting as hard as I can, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hiss of supplemental oxygen. "Just like the night you dressed up as. Sometimes the fight takes longer than we want it to." The oncology appointment, scheduled for December 15th, felt simultaneously urgent and impossibly distant. Bob's weight dropped 20 pounds in 6 weeks. His voice, once booming enough to call plays from the sidelines of Emma's soccer games, became a raspy whisper that forced family members to lean close just to hear him speak. The man who'd survived 3 tours in Vietnam was being defeated by an enemy that had taken up residence in his own body, growing stronger while he grew weaker. Sarah quit her part-time job at the local pharmacy to become Bob's full-time caregiver, a role that felt both natural and heartbreaking. She monitored his oxygen levels, administered his medications, and charted his symptoms with the precision she'd once applied to ICU patients. But unlike those patients, Bob wasn't getting better. If anything, he was slipping away a little more each day, and the knowledge that this decline might have been prevented made each difficult breath feel like an indictment. David worked overtime to cover the mounting medical bills. His police sergeant's salary stretched thin by co-pays and deductibles and the countless expenses that accumulate around serious illness. He came home each night exhausted, not just from his shifts, but from the helpless rage that consumed him every time he looked at his father. The man who'd taught him to stand up to bullies, to fight for what was right, to never back down from a challenge, was being beaten by a system that should have protected him. Thanksgiving dinner was a quiet affair, Bob's plate barely touched while Emma chattered about school and Christmas wishes with the determined optimism of a child trying to hold normalcy together through sheer force of will. Sarah had cooked all his favorite dishes: turkey with sage stuffing, sweet potato casserole, the green bean recipe that had been Martha's specialty, but Bob could manage only a few bites before the effort of swallowing became too much. "Tell me about when you and Grandma first met," Emma said, settling beside his chair after dinner. It had become their routine, these storytelling sessions that seemed to give Bob strength even when eating or walking had become monumental tasks. Bob's eyes brightened with the first genuine smile Sarah had seen in weeks. "Your grandmother was the prettiest nurse in Saigon," he began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Hair like spun gold, and a laugh that could make you forget where you were, even in the middle of a war zone." Emma listened with rapt attention, storing each detail like precious treasure, while Sarah fought back tears at the irony of Bob finding comfort in memories of military medicine, while American medicine had failed him so completely. The snow started falling in earnest the first week of December, blanketing Cleveland in white that made everything look clean and peaceful. But inside the Mitchell house, time had become the enemy. Each day brought new symptoms, new limitations, new reminders that December 15th might come too late to matter. Bob spent most of his time in the living room now, too weak to climb the stairs to his bedroom, surrounded by get-well cards from neighbors and fellow veterans who understood what it meant to fight battles that never really ended. Sarah maintained her vigil with the dedication of someone who'd taken an oath to do no harm, even though the harm had already been done by others who'd sworn the same oath. She read medical journals late into the night, searching for treatment options and second opinions and miracle cures that might still save the man who'd become the father she'd never had. But deep down, in the part of her mind that had been trained to recognize when hope becomes cruelty, she knew they were racing against time with an opponent that had already been given too much of a head start. December 20th arrived with the kind of bitter cold that seemed to seep through Cleveland's aging infrastructure and settle in the bones of anyone foolish enough to venture outside. Bob Mitchell had spent the day drifting in and out of sleep in his recliner, each breath a conscious effort that left him exhausted even in rest. The oxygen concentrator hummed its mechanical lullaby while Sarah monitored his vitals with the quiet desperation of someone watching sand slip through an hourglass. The collapse came at 2:17 a.m., announced by a crash that brought David running from his bedroom and sent Sarah's heart hammering against her ribs. She found Bob on the bathroom floor, his face gray in the harsh fluorescent light, gasping like a fish pulled from water. His pajamas were soaked with sweat, and the mass on his neck seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life, distended and angry against his pale skin. "Call 911, Sarah commanded, her nursing training taking over as she knelt beside her father-in-law and checked his pulse. Rapid, thready, irregular, all the signs of a system in distress. Bob's eyes rolled back as she tilted his head to open his airway, and for a terrifying moment she thought she'd lost him entirely. Then he gasped, a sound like tearing paper, and she knew they had minutes, not hours. The ambulance ride to Cleveland General felt like traveling through a nightmare where time moved both too fast and too slow. Bob drifted in and out of consciousness while paramedics worked over him, their radio chatter filling the vehicle with medical terminology that Sarah understood all too well. Respiratory distress, possible airway obstruction, BP dropping, ETA 4 minutes. Emma rode in David's patrol car behind the ambulance, her 8-year-old face pressed against the window as she watched the flashing lights cut through the darkness. She'd been awakened by the sirens and had refused to stay with neighbors, insisting with the fierce determination of childhood that she needed to be with her grandfather. "He promised he'd see me graduate," she whispered to herself, repeating the words like a prayer or a magic spell that might somehow hold death at bay. The emergency department at Cleveland General buzzed with controlled chaos, but even in the midst of a busy winter night, Bob's condition commanded immediate attention. Dr. Torres, the same physician who'd recommended imaging months earlier, took one look at his deteriorated state and began barking orders. "Get me a chest X-ray and arterial blood gas. I want ENT down here now. And somebody call the VA. This man needs to be transferred immediately." But the insurance maze that had trapped them for months wasn't finished with them yet. Bob's HMO wouldn't authorize a transfer to the VA hospital without documentation of medical necessity. The VA needed pre-authorization paperwork that could take hours to process. Meanwhile, Bob lay on a gurney in the emergency department, each breath a visible struggle. While bureaucrats debated the value of a Marine's life in actuarial tables and coverage limitations. "This is insane," David said, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fury. He'd spent his adult life believing in systems, the police department, the medical establishment, the insurance companies that promised to care for people when they needed it most. Now those same systems were failing the man who'd taught him to believe in justice and doing what was right. "He's dying while they shuffle papers." Sarah found herself on the phone with insurance representatives, VA administrators, and hospital billing departments, navigating a labyrinth of policies and procedures that seemed designed to delay rather than deliver care. "My father-in-law is a Vietnam veteran with 3 Purple Hearts," she said for the 10th time, her voice hoarse from repetition. "He's been waiting months for proper care, and now he's in respiratory failure. How is this not a medical emergency?" The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Torres, frustrated by the bureaucratic gridlock, called her mentor at the VA hospital directly. "Jim, I've got a Marine down here who's circling the drain while paper pushers play games. Can you cut through the red tape?" Within an hour, the transfer was approved, but by then Bob's condition had deteriorated further. His oxygen saturation hovered in the danger zone, and his blood pressure readings painted a picture of a body in crisis. The transfer to the VA hospital required another ambulance ride through Cleveland's icy streets, but this time the destination felt different. As they wheeled Bob through the entrance of the Louis Stokes Cleveland VA Medical Center, Sarah noticed the subtle changes, the way the staff moved with purpose rather than bureaucratic indifference, the photographs of veterans lining the hallways, the sense that this was a place where military service meant something more than a checkbox on an insurance form. Dr. Sarah Chen met them at the emergency entrance, her slight frame belying the authority in her voice as she took report from the paramedics. "Get him to Trauma Bay 3, she ordered, her hands already moving to assess Bob's airway while nurses attached monitors and started IV lines. "I want a stat CT of his neck and chest, arterial blood gas, complete metabolic panel, and get respiratory therapy down here now." The efficiency was breathtaking after months of delays and dismissals. Within 30 minutes, Bob was in the CT scanner. Within an hour, Dr. Chen had images that revealed the full extent of what they were dealing with. The mass had grown to compress his trachea and was pressing against major blood vessels. More concerning were the additional shadows that suggested the problem had spread beyond the original site. "Why wasn't this caught earlier?" Dr. Chen asked quietly, studying the scans with the grim expression of someone who'd seen too many preventable tragedies. "These changes didn't happen overnight. This has been progressing for months." Sarah's answer came through tears that had been building for weeks. "His doctor kept saying it was an infection. We begged for imaging, brought research, showed him VA protocols. He kept prescribing antibiotics and telling us to wait." The words tasted bitter with frustration and grief for time that could never be recovered. Bob stirred on the gurney, his eyes focusing on Dr. Chen with effort. "Doc," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "am I going to make it to Christmas?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, carrying the weight of promises made to a granddaughter and dreams of one more holiday with family. Dr. Chen's expression softened as she took Bob's hand, her touch gentle despite the urgency of his condition. "Mr. Mitchell, we're going to do everything we can, but I need to be honest with you. We're dealing with a very serious situation here. The delay in diagnosis has cost us valuable time." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We're going to fight this together, but I want you to know that the next few hours are critical." As if summoned by her words, David and Emma appeared in the doorway, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Emma's brave night costume had been replaced by hastily thrown-on clothes, but her determination remained unchanged. "Grandpa," she whispered, moving to his bedside with the careful steps of a child who understood that this moment was different from all the others. "I'm here. We're all here." Bob's eyes filled with tears as he looked at his family gathered around him, their love palpable even in the sterile environment of the trauma bay. Outside, dawn was breaking over Cleveland, painting the sky in shades of hope and possibility. But inside the VA hospital, time had become the enemy, and the battle for Bob Mitchell's life was about to begin in earnest. December 24th dawned with the cruel irony of perfect Christmas Eve weather. Fresh snow covering Cleveland like a blessing, children's laughter echoing from nearby sledding hills, the kind of morning that should have found Bob Mitchell watching Emma tear through wrapping paper with unbridled joy. Instead, he lay in a hospital bed at the VA Medical Center, connected to machines that breathed for him and monitored the failing rhythm of his heart. The test results had arrived like a death sentence wrapped in medical terminology. Dr. Chen's voice remained steady as she explained the scans to the family gathered around Bob's bedside, but her eyes betrayed the weight of what she was forced to deliver. "The imaging shows extensive involvement," she said, her words careful and precise. "The mass has infiltrated multiple structures in the neck, and there are concerning findings in the chest cavity as well." Sarah felt the words hit her like physical blows. Each clinical phrase, another nail in the coffin of hope she'd been building for months. "How long?" she whispered. The question every family member asks, but never once answered. "Without aggressive intervention, we're looking at days, possibly weeks," Dr. Chen replied, her professional composure cracking slightly. "The delay in diagnosis has significantly limited our options. If this had been caught 6 months ago—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. David turned away from the bed, his hands clenched into fists as rage and grief battled for dominance in his chest. This was the man who'd taught him to ride a bike, to throw a punch, to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. The idea that such strength could be defeated by bureaucratic incompetence felt like a cosmic injustice that his cop's sense of order couldn't process. Emma, too young to fully understand the medical terminology but old enough to read the devastation on the adults' faces, climbed carefully onto Bob's bed and nestled against his side. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the mechanical sounds of the ventilator. "You promised you'd see me graduate. You can't break promises." Bob's eyes, though dulled by medication and illness, focused on his granddaughter with the fierce intensity of a man trying to memorize every detail of her face. His hand, weakened by months of decline, found hers and squeezed with whatever strength remained. "Never broken a promise to you yet, sweetheart," he managed to whisper around the breathing tube. "Not planning to start now." But promises, however sincerely made, couldn't change the reality painted in stark black and white on the medical scans. The cancer, for that's what it was, finally diagnosed after months of dismissal, had spread with the relentless efficiency of an enemy that had been given too much time to entrench itself. What should have been caught and treated in its early stages had metastasized into something far more sinister. The blame game that followed was as predictable as it was painful. David called Dr. Williams, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury as he demanded explanations for months of medical malpractice. "You killed him," he said, the words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "You had all the information you needed, and you chose to ignore it because it was easier than doing your job." Williams' response was a mixture of defensiveness and deflection that only fueled David's rage. I followed standard diagnostic protocols, the doctor insisted. Not every elderly patient with respiratory symptoms has cancer. Sometimes the most obvious explanation is the correct one. Except when it isn't, Sarah interjected, having taken the phone from her husband. Except when the patient is a Vietnam veteran with a history of chemical exposure and symptoms that match established patterns of Agent Orange-related illness. You had access to VA guidelines, research protocols, medical literature that spelled out exactly what you should have been looking for. The conversation ended with threats of malpractice suits and medical board complaints, but no amount of legal action could restore the months that had been lost to willful blindness. Bob's condition continued to deteriorate throughout Christmas Eve day, his breathing becoming more labored despite the ventilator's assistance, his periods of consciousness growing shorter and more infrequent. As evening approached and the hospital took on the subdued atmosphere of a holiday spent in crisis, the family maintained their vigil with the desperate intensity of people watching time slip away. Sarah read Christmas stories from Emma's favorite book, her voice breaking occasionally as she tried to maintain normalcy in circumstances that defied every definition of normal. David sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair, his head in his hands, wondering how he would explain to his daughter that sometimes good people died not because God wanted them in heaven, but because other people failed to do their jobs. The Christmas Eve that should have been filled with laughter and gift wrapping and anticipation of Santa's arrival instead stretched before them like a funeral wake, marking not the birth of hope, but the approaching death of the man who had been their anchor, their strength, their unwavering source of love and wisdom for more years than seemed possible to count. Christmas morning arrived at the VA hospital with none of the joy that should have accompanied the holiday, replaced instead by the antiseptic smell of medical equipment and the steady beeping of monitors that had become Bob Mitchell's mechanical heartbeat. The family had spent the night in uncomfortable chairs around his bed, taking turns dozing fitfully while nurses came and went with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to watching over the dying. At 6:23 a.m., an unexpected visitor appeared in the doorway of Bob's room. Dr. Richard Williams stood there, looking nothing like the composed physician who had dismissed months of symptoms with cavalier certainty. His usually pristine appearance was disheveled, his white coat wrinkled, his face bearing the haggard expression of a man who had spent a sleepless night wrestling with demons that had finally broken free of whatever compartment he'd locked them in. David was on his feet instantly, his hand moving instinctively toward where his service weapon would normally rest. "Get out!" he snarled, his voice carrying the controlled violence of someone pushed beyond his breaking point. "You've done enough damage." But Williams didn't retreat. Instead, he stepped further into the room, his movements unsteady, his eyes fixed on Bob's unconscious form with an expression that bordered on anguish. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "about why I couldn't see what was right in front of me." Sarah moved protectively closer to Emma, who had been coloring quietly in a corner chair, her Christmas morning reduced to hospital crayons in the back of medical forms. "There's nothing you can say that will make this right," Sarah said, her voice cold with accumulated rage and grief. Williams's hands trembled as he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a photograph, yellowed with age and creased from years of handling. The image showed a much younger version of himself in jungle fatigues, standing beside a makeshift medical tent with other soldiers whose faces bore the 1,000-yard stare that came with too much exposure to war's reality. "Vietnam, 1969, he said, holding the photograph toward them with shaking fingers. 173rd Airborne, field medic. I was 22 years old and thought I could save everyone." His voice cracked on the last word, 40-year-old grief finally finding its voice. "I watched men die from Agent Orange exposure for months after I came home. Lung cancer, throat cancer, masses just like He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't bring himself to look at the growth on Bob's neck that had haunted his nightmares for months. The revelation hit the room like a physical force, recontextualizing everything they thought they knew about Williams's indifference. David's anger wavered as he processed what he was hearing, while Sarah felt her own fury collide with a nurse's instinctive understanding of trauma and its long-term consequences. "Every time I saw those symptoms," Williams continued, his professional composure finally crumbling entirely, "I was back in that jungle, watching my friends die while I stood by helpless. I couldn't face the possibility of watching another brother go through what they went through. So I told myself it was something else, anything else, because the alternative was admitting that the war was still killing people 50 years later." The silence that followed was broken only by the mechanical sounds of Bob's life support and Emma's quiet sniffling as she absorbed the adult conversation she didn't fully understand, but somehow felt the weight of. Williams moved closer to Bob's bedside, his weathered hands hovering over the man he'd failed with such catastrophic consequences. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of decades of suppressed guilt. "I'm so goddamn sorry, Marine. You deserved better from me. You all deserved better." But even as this revelation provided context for months of medical malpractice, another surprise was approaching Bob's room. Dr. Sarah Chen appeared in the doorway, her normally composed demeanor showing signs of excitement that seemed inappropriate for the grim circumstances. She carried a manila folder thick with additional test results and wore an expression that suggested the story wasn't over yet. "I need to speak with the family," she said, her voice urgent but not ominous. "There's been a development." William stepped back as Dr. Chen approached Bob's bedside, her movements deliberate and careful as she opened the folder and spread new imaging results across the bedside table. "We received the results of the emergency surgery biopsy," she began, her words measured and precise. "And the findings are unexpected." Sarah felt her heart stop as she prepared for news that could only be worse than what they'd already received. David moved closer to Emma, ready to shield her from whatever additional devastation was about to be delivered. But Dr. Chen's next words defied every expectation they'd formed over the past terrifying days. "It's not cancer," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of professional amazement and personal relief. "The mass is caused by a foreign object, metallic fragments that have been present for decades and have recently shifted position, causing massive inflammation and infection." The room seemed to tilt on its axis as the family processed information that contradicted everything they'd been told. Sarah was the first to find her voice. "Foreign object? What kind of foreign object?" Dr. Chen pulled out an X-ray image that showed Bob's neck in stark black and white, with several small, bright spots clearly visible near his trachea. "Shrapnel," she explained, "from what appears to be an explosion or gunfire. The fragments have been encapsulated by scar tissue for decades, but recently one piece shifted and perforated a major lymph node, causing the inflammation and growth that's been compressing his airway." Williams stared at the images with dawning comprehension and horror. "Agent Orange symptoms," he whispered. "I was so focused on looking for Agent Orange effects that I never considered traumatic injury. The cough, the neck mass, the breathing difficulties, they could all be explained by mechanical obstruction." The irony was devastating in its completeness. Williams' trauma-induced fixation on chemical exposure had blinded him to the possibility of physical injury, while his desperate attempt to avoid confronting Agent Orange cases had led him to miss a diagnosis that had nothing to do with chemical warfare at all. "Can it be treated?" David asked, his voice barely controlled as hope and disbelief warred in his chest. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "The surgery will be complex because of the location and the amount of scar tissue involved, but yes, if we can remove the fragments and treat the infection, his prognosis improves dramatically." She paused, her expression growing more serious. However, the delay in diagnosis has cost us valuable time. The infection is severe, and his overall condition has been compromised by months of inadequate treatment. Emma looked up from her coloring with the bright curiosity of childhood cutting through adult complexity. Does that mean Grandpa isn't going to die? The question hung in the air with all the weight of hope and fear that had accumulated over months of medical uncertainty. Dr. Chen knelt beside Emma's chair, her voice gentle but honest. It means we have a much better chance of helping him get better, sweetheart. But he's been very sick for a long time, so it's going to take time and a lot of fighting on his part. As if summoned by the conversation, Bob's eyes fluttered open for the first time in hours. His gaze found Emma first, then moved to each family member in turn, finally settling on Dr. Chen with something approaching recognition. "Doc," he whispered around his breathing tube, "did someone say something about fighting?" Because Marines don't know how to do anything else. The laughter that followed was tinged with tears and disbelief, but for the first time in months, it carried genuine hope rather than desperate bravado. Williams stood at the edge of the group, his own tears flowing freely as he witnessed the resurrection of a man he'd nearly killed through his own psychological paralysis. "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Chen said, taking Bob's hand with professional warmth, "we're going to get you into surgery as soon as possible. We're going to remove those pieces of Vietnam that have been trying to finish what they started 50 years ago." Bob's grip on her hand was weak but determined. "Doctor," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word, "I made a promise to my granddaughter that I'd see her graduate. I don't break promises to little girls, especially not brave ones who dress up like knights." Emma giggled through her tears, moving closer to her grandfather's bedside. "I'm going to be right here when you wake up, Grandpa. Me and my invisible armor will protect you while the doctors fix you up." Outside Bob's hospital room window, Christmas morning continued in Cleveland with the ordinary magic of children discovering presents and families gathering around breakfast tables. But inside the VA Medical Center, a different kind of miracle was taking shape, the kind that comes not from divine intervention but from human perseverance, medical expertise, and the stubborn refusal of a Marine to let an old war claim final victory over his promise to see his granddaughter grow up. 6 months later, the June sun painted Cleveland in shades of possibility, as Bob Mitchell stood at his kitchen counter, breathing deeply without the assistance of oxygen tanks or mechanical devices for the first time since the previous autumn. The surgery had been a success beyond Dr. Chen's most optimistic projections. 3 pieces of shrapnel removed from tissue that had held them captive for over 50 years, along with the infected lymph nodes that had nearly cost him his life. The recovery had been slow and sometimes agonizing, but Bob Mitchell had approached rehabilitation with the same stubborn determination that had carried him through 3 tours in Vietnam. Emma bounded through the kitchen door with the exuberant energy of a 9-year-old who had just finished her last day of 3rd grade, her backpack flying behind her as she launched herself into her grandfather's arms. "Grandpa, guess what? I got all A's on my report card. And Mrs. Henderson said I was the best reader in the whole class." Bob lifted her with ease that would have been impossible just months before, spinning her around the kitchen while Sarah watched from the doorway with tears of joy in her eyes. The man who had nearly died on Christmas Eve was now strong enough to sweep his granddaughter off her feet, his laughter filling the house with the sound of life reclaimed from the edge of loss. "That's my girl," Bob said, setting Emma down and ruffling her hair. "Smart like your grandmother, brave like your daddy, and stubborn like your old grandpa. You're going to change the world someday, sweetheart." The kitchen table was set for a celebration dinner, not just for Emma's excellent grades, but for the milestone that Bob's recovery represented. David arrived home from his shift at the police department to find his father helping Sarah prepare his famous barbecued ribs, the same recipe that had made 4th of July gatherings legendary in their neighborhood. The sight of Bob standing at the stove, sleeves rolled up and completely absorbed in the ritual of cooking for his family, struck David as nothing short of miraculous. "How are you feeling, Dad?" David asked, though the answer was written clearly in Bob's improved posture, clearer breathing, and the return of color to his cheeks. "Like I've got a second chance to get things right," Bob replied, turning from the stove to embrace his son. "And like I've got people in my corner who never gave up on me, even when I was ready to give up on myself." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Sarah answered to find Dr. Sarah Chen standing on their porch, no longer in her hospital scrubs but dressed casually for what she'd explained was a personal visit. In her hands was a manila envelope that she carried with the reverence reserved for precious documents. "Dr. Chen!" Emma exclaimed, running to greet the woman who had become something of a family hero. "Grandpa's making ribs. Do you want to stay for dinner?" Dr. Chen's smile was radiant as she accepted the invitation, but her expression grew more serious as she pulled Bob aside for a private conversation. "I wanted to show you something," she said, opening the envelope to reveal a faded photograph and several official-looking documents. "After your surgery, I did some research into your military records. I found something I think you need to see." The photograph showed a group of Marines gathered around a South Vietnamese interpreter, their faces dirty and exhausted but alive with the relief of having survived another firefight. In the center of the group, unmistakably younger but clearly recognizable, stood Bob Mitchell with his arm around the slight shoulders of a man whose features bore a striking resemblance to Dr. Chen. "This is my father," Dr. Chen said quietly, pointing to the interpreter in the photograph. "Lieutenant Nguyen Van Chen, Army of the Republic of Vietnam. According to the mission reports, he guided your unit safely through an ambush at Firebase Charlie on March 15, 1969. The official record states that his actions saved the lives of 12 American Marines." Bob stared at the photograph with growing amazement, his finger tracing the faces of men he hadn't seen in over 50 years. "Charlie," he whispered, the memories flooding back with startling clarity. "We called him Charlie because we couldn't pronounce his real name. He knew those jungles better than anyone, and he risked his life every day to keep us alive. After the war, my father brought our family to America, Doctor." Chen continued. "He became a citizen, worked as a translator for the Immigration Service, and never stopped talking about the Marines he'd served with. He always said that debt could never be repaid, that he owed his freedom to the Americans who trusted him with their lives." The revelation created a perfect circle of connection that seemed to transcend coincidence and enter the realm of destiny. The daughter of the man who had saved Bob's life in Vietnam had been the one to save his life again 50 years later in a Cleveland hospital. The poetic justice of it left the entire family speechless. "There's more," Dr. Chen said, pulling additional documents from the envelope. "After your case gained attention at the hospital, I started reviewing other veteran files. We discovered 17 cases over the past 5 years where similar diagnostic delays had occurred. The VA is implementing new protocols based on what we learned from your situation. Your suffering wasn't in vain. It's going to prevent other veterans from going through the same thing." David felt a mixture of satisfaction and continued anger at the systemic failures that had nearly cost his father's life. "What about Dr. Williams? Has there been any accountability for what happened?" Dr. Chen's expression grew thoughtful. "Dr. Williams has voluntarily entered a PTSD treatment program and has requested assignment to the VA's Veteran Mental Health Initiative. He's also testified before the State Medical Board about the need for better screening protocols for healthcare providers who are themselves veterans. It turns out his case wasn't unique. there are other doctors struggling with similar issues. The idea that Williams's failure might lead to broader reforms provided some measure of comfort, though it couldn't erase the months of unnecessary suffering. Bob, however, seemed more interested in forgiveness than retribution. "The man was fighting his own war," he said quietly. "Sometimes the battles we fight inside our heads are harder than the ones we fight on foreign soil." As if summoned by their conversation, Williams himself appeared at the front door, looking remarkably different from the defensive, dismissive physician they'd encountered months earlier. His face showed the effects of intensive therapy, but also a peace that had been absent during their previous encounters. In his hands, he carried a small gift wrapped in simple brown paper. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said when Bob invited him into the house, "but I wanted to give you something that's been in my possession for far too long." He handed the package to Bob with hands that no longer trembled. "It belonged to a friend of mine who didn't make it home from Vietnam. I think he would have wanted another Marine to have it." Bob unwrapped the package to reveal a Purple Heart medal, tarnished with age but unmistakably authentic. Williams's eyes filled with tears as he explained, "Tommy Rodriguez, 173rd Airborne. He saved my life during a mortar attack and died 3 days later from complications of Agent Orange exposure. I've carried his Purple Heart for 50 years, too afraid to give it to his family because it would mean admitting what we both went through over there." The gesture was profound in its simplicity and pain. Williams was finally releasing not just the physical medal, but the psychological burden that had shaped his medical practice and led to Bob's near-death experience. "I can't give Tommy back to his family," Williams continued, "but I can honor his memory by making sure other veterans get the care they deserve." The evening that followed was unlike any the Mitchell family had experienced, a gathering that included not just their immediate circle, but the extended family of people whose lives had been changed by Bob's ordeal. Dr. Chen shared stories of her father's experiences in Vietnam. Williams spoke hesitantly but honestly about his struggles with PTSD, and Emma listened with the wide-eyed fascination of a child discovering that the adults in her life had lived entire adventures before she was born. As the sun set over Cleveland, Bob sat on his front porch with Emma curled against his side, both of them watching fireflies begin their nightly dance across the yard. "Grandpa," Emma said, her voice sleepy with contentment, "are you glad you didn't die?" Bob's laughter was rich with joy and gratitude for second chances. "Sweetheart, I'm glad I got to keep my promise to see you grow up. But more than that, I'm glad we all learned that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones that help other people fight their own wars." Inside the house, Sarah and David cleaned dishes while Dr. Chen and Williams compared notes about veteran healthcare initiatives, their conversation animated by shared purpose and the possibility of preventing future tragedies. The kitchen was filled with the warmth of a family that had survived crisis together and emerged stronger, bound not just by blood, but by the knowledge that love and persistence could overcome even the most stubborn obstacles. As Emma drifted off to sleep against her grandfather's chest, Bob Mitchell looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky and felt profound gratitude for the gift of time, time to watch his granddaughter grow, time to heal old wounds, time to help other veterans find their way home from wars that never really end. The piece of Vietnam that had nearly killed him was gone, but the best parts of his military service, the brotherhood, the commitment to never leave anyone behind, the determination to fight for what was right, those would live on in the legacy he was building one day at a time. Bob Mitchell's story reminds us that our greatest battles aren't always fought on foreign soil. Sometimes they're fought in doctors' offices, insurance companies, and hospital corridors where our voices seem to disappear into bureaucratic silence. At 68, Bob nearly lost everything because the system failed to see him as more than just another aging complaint. But his family's love, a determined daughter-in-law who refused to give up, and the miraculous discovery that sometimes our assumptions are wrong. These turned a death sentence into a second chance at life. How many of us have felt invisible in medical settings, dismissed because of our age, or struggled to advocate for ourselves when we needed care most? Bob's journey from that terrifying Christmas Eve to watching Emma graduate reminds us that persistence pays off, that family bonds can move mountains, and that it's never too late for miracles. His story proves that our voices matter, our military service deserves respect, and that sometimes the very experiences we think will break us become the foundation for helping others. The grandfather who nearly died became an advocate who saved countless other veterans from the same fate. What medical challenges have you or your loved ones faced that required persistent advocacy? Have you ever felt dismissed by healthcare providers because of your age or background? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to keep fighting for the care they deserve.